This is our introduction to ecosystems. So before we actually get into things like behaviors and roles and some adaptations and some different cycles within ecosystems, we need to understand the actual hierarchy or the makeup of different groups of organisms within ecosystems and the interaction these organisms have with their physical world. So when we start talking about the organization of living organisms, okay, so when we talk about organisms, we're actually talking about things that are living. They're referred to as biotic or from the biotic world. The opposite of that, anything that is non-living, okay, so we say that this is biotic. Anything that is non-living within an ecosystem is said to be abiotic. So examples of that include water, okay, without any of the organisms, or air, or rocks, and structures that, not that once were living, but structures that have never been living. The other really important thing to understand is that this classification of living organisms, it's actually known as an area of science, an area of biology. It's called taxonomy. And you will be actually looking at taxonomy and evolution in secondary 2. Okay, but all of these classifications and these groupings of organisms, these are human inventions. Okay, so humans have decided that they want to classify these things. And so what do we use to classify? Well, we use organisms' physical characteristics, so their physical appearance, how their nose looks versus their height versus their build, okay, their coloring, etc. And more recently, we've started to actually look at specific genetic characteristics. So genetic characteristics may lead to actual physical characteristics, or genetic characteristics might not actually even be visible, okay, to the average person's eye. So we use these actual characteristics to help us classify these organisms. And the more physically familiar or similar an organism is, the more closely related it is. Okay, so later on we'll learn about scientific names for organisms and how we go about classifying them, but that all leads back to taxonomy, and that's a grade 8 topic. So we've talked about the fact that the organization of living things is a human invention, but the importance of it, I mean, it does have, there is a reason behind it, and that reason is that it helps with actual communication between different people around the world. So it helps with the sharing of knowledge. All right? So once we start looking into all of this, we see that there's an actual breakdown. And the most basic form of classification for living organisms is the actual species, the individual species of plants, the species of animals, the species of unicellular organisms, the species of fungus. There are all kinds of different types of organisms out there, and every one of them has a distinct species classification. So a species is defined as a group of similar organisms that are capable of sharing genetic information through interbreeding. What does that mean? That basically means that organisms can mate and they can have offspring or babies, and when those babies grow, those babies will be able to actually have babies of their own. Okay? So that's akin to saying that a human male and a human female mate and have a child. That child will then grow and be able to mate with another child or another adult at that point to have their own children. Okay? So if we look at the image of the horse and the donkey. So horses and donkeys are actually somewhat closely related. Okay, they're in the same group of classified animals, but they are not the same species. And you can actually tell that by looking at them. Okay, so a couple of the actual physical traits here are pointed out. But when a horse and a donkey mate, they're close enough in terms of their classification that they can produce offspring. The offspring is the mule. So both of these combine to give us a mule. However, mules are sterile, which means they cannot have babies. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about similar characteristics, and using physical characteristics to actually show species differentiation. If you look at the different bears here, like we talked about in class, you notice that even though they are all three considered to be bears, there are some actually different physical features about each of them that makes them their own distinct species. So once we have the idea of a species, as a grouping of organisms or a specific type of organism that when it mates with another similar organism, they will be able to produce fertile offspring, okay? Babies that can make babies. Well, within an area, we tend to have organisms that live in groups. Okay, and we call these similar organisms populations. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species living in an area together. They may be related or they may not be related, but they are all examples of the same kind of species. So examples of that include prides of lions where the females are not related, they're different. Okay, herds of caribou. So this is an example of the Bathurst herd. All right, so it's a variety of different caribou here. Some of them are actually related to others, but some are not. Okay, and then you've got things like flocks of birds. So when you see geese flying in the fall and in the spring, okay, they're not all related to one another, but they do live and function in a group. So that is known as a population. Okay? So that brings us to something even bigger. Now, if we look at this image, this is actually an image of a watering hole in Africa. Okay? Somewhere in Africa. And it illustrates the idea of a community perfectly. Okay? A community incorporates organisms of a variety of different species. So what we now have, where we have an actual species, we have a species here, and that actually gives rise to a variety of species organisms in a population. Okay, so a variety of organisms. Within the actual community, we start to see a variety of different organisms, okay, inhabiting the same area. Okay, so there's different numbers of these organisms, and they're all kind of living together. Okay, so this collectively is known as a community. Whereas the previous is known as a population, and that first individual is known as a species of an organism. So we see that we're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you look at this image, you can see that there are elephants, there's zebras, there's giraffes. I'm sure that there's probably some lions or hyenas in there somewhere. There's birds in the trees. There's probably insects. Okay, these are all organisms that are taking their own actual food from a central location. They're all living in a same area. Kind of like we do in a city. Okay, we've got different kind of groups of people known as families. All right, so different families all inhabit the same more or less area, and they use the same stores to get their food, to go play sports, to go to the movies, all kinds of things. Okay, this actually ends up being encompassed. So far we've only been talking about living organisms. All right, so far we've got the idea of the species. Right? So we've got our species, which then many of them gives us our population of that same species. And then we see that we can get an actual community, and that community is made up of different populations, right? Of organisms, different populations, all living together. But what actually comprises an ecosystem is that we actually, in the ecosystem, we actually take advantage of the non-living items or abiotic parts of that environment. So it's all the populations. So we've got rock, we've got water, we've got air. Okay, and then we've got all of these actual populations that make up the actual community. Okay, and all of those collectively are comprised of an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is defined as the interaction of all living organisms. They can be microscopic, which means really, really small. Right? So really, really small, or macroscopic, which means, life size. So large. Okay? It involves the physical environment as well as the organisms living in the physical environment. So you see some pictures here of a variety of different ecosystems. Every one of those ecosystems is going to be good for the organisms that choose to live there. Or I should say, instead of choose, the organisms that have evolved to be able to live there. All right? So when we're talking about ecosystems and we're looking at these images, okay, let's look at the marine image there with the sea turtle and the coral and the tropical fish. Well, you're not going to find a polar bear living there. Okay, because it's the actual environment is not conducive to that organism. Just like you won't find a bunch of trees growing there. Similarly, if you look at the desert, you're going to find organisms that survive in areas that don't have a lot of water because there isn't a lot of water there. So if you're something that needs a tremendous amount of water, you will not do well in that kind of ecosystem. All right? So if we finish this off, this image I like because it gives you an idea of how interconnected all of this vocabulary is. And it shows you how we start off with that individual being here. And I'm actually going to write the word species here because I think that organism and species can be used interchangeably here. Okay, and then we see that this one bison is a species of an organism, and it grows into a population of bison. Now, bison usually live in grasslands, so here we see that there's grass, there's snakes, there's bison, there's hawks, there's prairie dogs, which are kind of like sort of little gophers. Okay, and then we see the community, all right? We see that being built up even more in the ecosystem because then we see the interaction of the air, the rocks, the mountains, all right? The stream that feeds them. And we see how it all interconnects. Now, we can do one more than that, but we're not going to. I'm not going to include biosphere or biome or things like that. We'll talk about those another day. So this is a really good snapshot of the vocabulary that we're going to be using in this unit.